John Banno. I'm a board member of the James Holshouser Jr. Speaker Series. We have some other board members here with us tonight. Stephen Lader is here. Stephen, raise your hand. Kay Wilt, President of the North Carolina Federation of Republican Women. John Browarding, former chair for Moore County GOP. We strive to bring speakers that talk about issues that are important to us at the moment. In the past, we've had Dr. Ben Carson talking about the medical situation in our country. We've had Brent Bozell, who is former chairman of the Media Research Center, who's now the ambassador to South Africa, I think. I don't know whether he's been confirmed or not. But we've had 8 or 10 really great speakers over the years, and tonight's no exception. We've had, for instance, one of Johnathan Butcher's colleagues at Heritage who spoke to us about the border situation about 8 or 9 months ago, and surprisingly, the border situation seems to be under control now, so that's a good thing. I have to start by saying that I've lost a dear friend today. Bill Damascus. So I hope you pray for him. And Alice. I'm going to ask Charlie to come up and pray for us. Take him for Bill.
Thank you, John. Would you pray with me? Dear Father, God of the universe, we come to you now with heavy hearts. We thank you for the life of Bill. And we find comfort knowing that he is in your arms. And we are so thankful that one day we will be reunited with him and live with you for eternity. Father, we thank you for the Heritage Institution and for all the good work they do. We are so blessed by all of their activities and what they do to help the conservative values of this country, the Judeo-Christian values. And Lord, tonight I pray for the speaker tonight. You would give him your words to speak and give us ears to hear. Pray that you will be with Alice tonight and comfort her. I thank you for the strong faith that she has in you, knowing that she will be with him again. Father, we ask all of these things for all believers in the blessed name of our Lord Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Charlie. Let me introduce Jim Sanderlin, who is the Senior Assistant to the President for Donor Relations for the Heritage Foundation. And I'll ask him to introduce our speaker tonight. Just a little bit about my relationship with Heritage. I was a lobbyist for the last 7 or 8 years of my career with 3M Company. I went into Washington thinking I knew everything about everything. And I learned very quickly that I knew nothing about nothing. Heritage was part of my education, and so I've been a loyal supporter and donor to the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action ever since. So, Jim, come on up and say hello.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Tom, and everyone else who had a hand in arranging this. I'm sorry that it's having a difficult evening with the loss of your friend. Our prayers are with you. The Heritage Foundation serves as your outpost in Washington, D.C. And as I was telling some folks earlier, you know, the bad ideas from liberals and now the rise of Marxism and even communism in some places in our country, this makes the work of the Heritage Foundation even more necessary. But we are full of hope. We have witnessed an awakening of the American people in the last few years. Sometimes things have to get very bad for some folks to open their eyes and pay attention, and that has happened, and we're grateful for Americans like you for coming to events like this and learning and sharing it with your people. Heritage is involved in any national issue you could think of. We have experts and leaders in those issues that influence the White House, Congress, governors, state legislators. We educate Americans, and most importantly, we are reaching the next generation. And that's what Johnathan is especially involved in at Heritage. Johnathan Butcher is the acting director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. He has researched and testified on education policy around the U.S., including testimony before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He serves as chair of the South Carolina Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. By the way, Johnathan and I both live in South Carolina, and not to give you the impression that all of Heritage lives in South Carolina, we're special. We don't have to live in Washington, thank goodness. Johnathan is the author of Splintered, Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth. You might have seen that book when you came in. I'd encourage you to get a copy. In a few weeks, Johnathan's next book will be released. It's called The Polarization Myth, and you'll be hearing about the themes in that book shortly. There's much more I could say, but one more thing in closing. Our South Carolina Governor, Henry McMaster, nominated Johnathan a few years ago to serve on the board of the South Carolina Public Charter School District, a statewide charter school authorizer, and is the father of 2 high school boys in a charter school in South Carolina. I am very grateful for Johnathan's service in that area. Please welcome Johnathan Butcher.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Tom, for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to those that put together the Governor James Holshouser Speaker Series for this very kind invitation. So, you have 2 options this evening for those of you who either agree or disagree with what I have to say. For those in the back, you can either throw things, which, given the distance, might be a challenge, or you have a pen and pad on your tables, and you can write questions. And if you'd like to give those questions either to Jim, or Jim can direct them to someone else, to Jim, or pass them forward at the end, they'll be walking around with the mic in a few moments, and we'll take questions when we finish. So, let me be clear. I'm a researcher and a writer. My wife has prohibited me from actually entering politics. And why, I asked her once. She said to me, Johnathan, I'll tell you a story. She said, there was once a Republican who was running for office in a small town and went to a farmer and said, hey, look, I'd love to give a talk to some of the local farms in your area. And the farmer said, well, sir, I'm a Democrat, but if you're a Republican, I'll let you give a talk here. The only thing I have for you is this here pile of manure to stand on so that everyone can see and hear you. And the farmer said, this will be the first time that I've ever heard a Republican, give a stump speech. And the candidate said, well, this is the first time I've ever given a speech on top of the Democratic Party platform. Many thanks to Ronald Reagan for that story. So, I have quite a bit of policy to discuss this evening, and some of it is best told through stories. So I'll begin with this one. Scarlett Johnson described her Wisconsin town in McQuan-Thiensville, the McQuan-Thiensville School District, as quiet, friendly, and nice. But in a story that will sound familiar to parents around the country, over the past several years, and I talked with her easily in 2021, 2022, and after, she began noticing not so friendly and nice material that some of her children, high school students, were working on via Zoom during the 2020 school closures due to the COVID pandemic. So as she said to me in an interview, she said, everything is being viewed through the lens of race. There is division among the parents in our community on the issue now, so divisive and so unnecessary, Scarlett told me. Much of the material was focused on making kids, quote, social justice warriors. Scarlett explained to me that she does not want to ignore the difficult discussions about race and discrimination. Quote, I just wanted them to have a liberal education, truly in the sense of the word. Yet educators from her children's school district had been taken in by the, quote, equity training programs, where presenters pushed the oppression narrative, complete with recommendations that educators rely on staples from the critical race theory canon, such as pedagogy of the oppressed and white fragility. Scarlett says that McQuan-Thiensville officials adopted many of the same critical race theory themed goals of the Elmbrook School District, which was right down the road, 20 miles away. Their equity training presentations inform teachers that oppression, marginalization, they're historical, structural, cultural, and systemic. There was nothing that the United States could do to get away from these things. Although one presentation says that there should be high-quality teaching and learning for all learners, the presenters defined that in the terms of a system that is oppressing students, and it's the system that is responsible for student failure, not the student's own actions or hard work. Instruction should be based on identity-relevant teaching, the presenter said, and quoted from any number of critical pedagogy teaching manuals. So the message is clear. Students are no longer responsible for outcomes in their lives, and teachers should adjust instruction according to a student's classification in some sort of tribe. So let's lay down some terms. William F. Buckley, the founder of National Review magazine, eminent conservative of another age, he wrote that the aims of education are to forward knowledge and right conduct at the expense of some points of view. So there is right conduct. We can't simply throw ideas in the air and have students catch what falls. It is our job to shape their characters. Buckley says it this way: to assume, as academic freedom implicitly does, that every student should, in non-scientific matters, begin afresh, start over, as if Plato and Aristotle and St. Augustine and St. Thomas had among them reached not one dependable conclusion, is to double the very structure of learning. It's to doubt that there are any aims at all to education. So I bothered to write a book about critical race theory because Americans were seeing it all around them. It was being inundated in school districts all across the country. It was given different names: culturally relevant teaching, diversity, equity, and inclusion, multiculturalism in some cases, even equity, social justice. Where do all these words come from, and what do they mean? And why did I write a book? The point, the objective, was to give us a sense of place in this moment of cultural history. We have to understand where we are and where these ideas are coming from. So when the Detroit superintendent, so the superintendent of Detroit Public Schools, stood up before the school board a couple of years ago and said his district is deeply using critical race theory. When Hayward Unified District, just across the bay in San Francisco, said that they would make sure that critical race theory remained in the school's ethnic studies curriculum. When Loudoun County, Virginia, said that they would teach their teachers how to talk about critical race theory to students. And on and on. We need to know what this means. We need to know where it comes from, and what the implications are, and what they're asking students to do. So many have heard of DEI at this point in time. Many of you know diversity, equity, and inclusion. But at the root of DEI, and I'll get to talking about DEI here in a little bit, but at the root is what is known as critical theory. So 100 years ago, a group of German Marxists became very frustrated that Germany had not progressed along the path towards a socialist system as had just happened in the Bolshevik Revolution in what would become the Soviet Union. They decided that they would come together and have what became known as the first Marxist work week in Germany. And these German intellectuals then convinced the University of Frankfurt to let them establish what became known as the Frankfurt School. It was a school dedicated to the study of Marxism. They actually wanted to call it the Marxist Cultural Center, but decided, given even then the knowledge of what Marx had done from communism, steered away from it. But nevertheless, the Frankfurt School became known as Café Marx. These were Jewish intellectuals, and as you know, who came to power not a decade later. These members of the Frankfurt School were developing Marxism beyond just economic theory, but actually to deal with culture. They were chased out of Germany and came to Columbia University in 1937, where they settled. And from there, they began to establish what became known as critical theory. They called it critical theory because traditional theory, as it had been known, was based on the ideas of the Enlightenment. It was based on the ideas that there is a right and wrong way of describing either the present or the future or the past. That there are, in fact, objective truths, there are facts in the world around us. Critical theory questions that theory. Critical theory draws all that we knew from Western civilization. It calls it all into doubt. So, from Columbia, these intellectuals spread across the country, especially to California, Berkeley, as well as other universities in New York. Some returned to Germany, including one of the founders, Max Horkheimer, but notably some of the others, such as Herbert Marcuse, remained in the United States, where they would train future Marxists and revolutionaries, including Angela Davis, who bought the guns that were used to assassinate a judge in the 1970s. So, what are the themes that critical theory brought to the idea of how we interpret the world around us? So listen to Angela Harris, a professor of law at the University of California, San Diego. Quote, Marx's dazzling analysis of capitalism and his conviction that the laws of historical materialism would bring on the revolution of the proletariat as inevitably as the sun rises are still riveting to contemporary theorists. She wrote that in 2002. Remember that the goal of critical theory is not to bring about a system of order, but a system of disorder and revolution. Here is how one critical theorist describes it. American civil rights law is not aimed at improving conditions for blacks, except on the rare occasions when doing so coincides with whites' self-interest. Critical theory calls into question the ideas of laws that we base our civil rights laws, our civil rights system on. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, writes one critical race theorist, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. All right, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves because I've already moved on to critical race theory. But let me go quickly from what happened coming out of the 40s, 50s, 60s as critical theory began to develop, and these ideas of a renewed sense of Marxism infiltrated colleges around the country. A group of legal scholars caught wind of what critical theory was trying to do to a nation built on the rule of law and said, we can apply critical theory two systems of law in the United States and argue, as they chose to do, that law in the US was meant to be oppressive and confining. It was meant to be something that held down the oppressed. Skipping forward through the 1970s and into the 1980s, a group of these legal scholars said, well, it's true, we believe that as critical theorists, American law is oppressive, but it's not just American law, it's actually race. Everything in the United States should be defined in terms of racism. Everything is caused by racism. It is the only explanation for anything. And that gave birth in 1989 to critical race theory. So there are examples today throughout politics of how critical race theory shapes thinking even of politicians. Such as when Biden said he had sex and race-specific guidelines for choosing a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Now there are claims, of course, from those on the left that critical race theory is a myth, that it's just a boogeyman that's been raised by conservatives to scare people into supporting conservative causes. They argue that it's not being taught in schools. Yet, in fact, the African American Policy Forum had a critical race theory summer school in 2024 featuring Kimberly Crenshaw, who was one of the founders of critical race theory. I mentioned the Detroit Public School Superintendent's message to the school board a couple of years ago. It's still available on YouTube. President Trump and the U.S. Department of Education just earlier this year canceled $600 million in grants to K-12 schools that all had the applications of critical race theory as a part of the grant applications. It is still happening now, that's right. So that's myth number one, that critical race theory is not being taught in schools. We can dismiss that. So what about the second myth? The second myth is that critical race theory, it's just about teaching history. It's just a lens through which we can see historical events. Well, in fact, California's mathematics curriculum for the entire state, that was a model curriculum designed by the State Department of Education, it has in it the idea that white privilege is at the root cause of systemic racism. I don't know why that's in the math curriculum, but it's in there. Actually, Bill Gates underwrote a private effort to create the same kind of curriculum. It's called equitable math, and it has the same ideas in it, saying that math and the disparities in student outcomes are due to white privilege. In California and Minnesota, they have wrapped critical race theory into their ethnic studies standards. It's being taught across the subject areas in Minnesota. It's a law in Minnesota that ethnic studies will be a part of all of the subjects. In my book, in Splintered, I talk about a movement that was happening around 2020, 21, and before called #DisruptTexts. And the effort was to remove To Kill a Mockingbird, anything by Shakespeare, the Odyssey from school curriculum. So it's not just a way to look at history. This is a movement to disrupt the very systems and the very way that we understand knowledge and information. Okay, the third myth is that critical race theory is tolerant. Critical race theory, and this is a quote, critical race theory sees the official school curriculum as a culturally specific artifact designed to maintain a white supremacist master script. That's from Gloria Ladson-Billings, a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin, one of the founders of critical race theory. In another quote, I've already quoted from Angela Harris, but I'll do so once more. In the same essay, where she linked critical race theory to Marx's ideas, she also said the following: challenging power relations, as critical theorists love to do, means provoking anger, disquiet, anxiety, and even fear in those with a settled understanding of who they are and where they belong. So, as you can imagine, this is unsettling. And as parents learn more about what their children are being taught in schools coming out of the COVID pandemic, policymakers and officials were noticing this as well. As state lawmakers across the country began to consider legislation that would prohibit not the teaching of certain ideas, but they would prohibit compelled speech. They prohibited the idea that you could force students to affirm these ideas of critical race theory or to believe these ideas of critical race theory. That became a key part of the pushback to all of the effort to teach critical race theory across schools with legislation such as this. But in Montana, the state attorney general, Austin Knudsen, issued a binding opinion to the state of Montana, where he said the following. He said, in many instances, the uses of critical race theory and, quote, anti-racism programming discriminates on the basis of race, color, or national origin in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, legal officials, they realized, they recognized that this was not just teaching students to view history in a certain way. It was actually telling students to treat people differently based on their immutable characteristics, and that violates civil rights law. Make no mistake, critical race theory, when applied, violates civil rights law. So what does that mean for DEI and all that we've heard over the past several years about diversity, equity, and inclusion? So DEI can be defined this way. DEI is the administrative application of critical race theory. So how is it done? What does that mean? Well, critical race theory is teaching individuals to see each other based on their skin color, based on their ethnicity, and to consider everything in history as the result of some form of discrimination. DEI advocates for this in public and private life. So for example, in 2023, the US Supreme Court considered a case that would deal with colleges that were admitting students based on race, or more specifically, they were denying students entry to college based on race. There were college officials, college presidents, and other college administrators around the country who were a part of DEI offices, or on campuses that had DEI offices, that wrote amicus briefs in favor of using racial preferences in college admissions. That is what DEI does. In K-12 schools in Denver, Colorado, they had segregated times for parents to bring their children to the playground, segregated by race. There were colleges like Columbia in New York that had segregated graduation ceremonies. Just 2 weeks ago, I talked to a nursing student in Michigan. She attended Grand Valley University in Michigan, and she told me that in her nursing program, they had entire class sessions, all about how to use the appropriate pronouns for individuals. Now, make no mistake, I moved very quickly here from talking about race to talking about gender, but they're one and the same. They're one and the same because it is all a part of the same identity politics that critical race theory uses to classify everyone according to categories. Let me give you one more story about DEI. So Chad Ellis is a scientist, a chemist to be exact. Exactness is something he appreciates. He told me, if I'm exposed to a chemical spill, I deserve to know what's in that. If I'm exposed to something, I deserve to know where it's coming from and who stands behind it, he said in writing. So when he was required to attend a DEI training program at work, he worked for Chevron Phillips in Oklahoma. The session was called Hear and Heard. He wanted to know what he was being taught and where it was coming from. Why was he, as a chemist, being told that George Washington's teeth were pulled from the mouths of enslaved persons, as the DEI trainer said, and that America is beset by systemic racism? What do these things have to do with designing plastic materials? The DEI training not only took aim at America's foundational civil rights laws, but was also meant to cause anxiety among the trainees. Ellis said the DEI trainer, who happened to be a real estate agent, not a PhD in counseling, but with any identifiable academic background in race relations, told the Chevron employees that, quote, people are going to leave the training angry. That was the goal. The goal of the training was not to promote racial harmony, but to create distress in the attendees' minds. Provoking people with claims of systemic racism is not inclusive. It does more to create suspicion than to foster a healthy workplace. Ellis eventually would file a lawsuit against these trainings, and I'll spare you the details, but it is fascinating to know who he was able to get to write a letter on his behalf. He found a woman named Susan Brandon, a psychologist who worked as a research chief at the Defense Intelligence Agency, an office in the U.S. Department of Defense. Brandon had an impressive background, having served in the high-value detainee interrogation group, a program involving the Federal Bureau of Investigation, CIA, and Department of Defense. In a letter from Brandon that Ellis used in his court filings, Brandon stressed that she's not an expert in DEI, but she said that her experience allowed her to determine that the videos in the Hear and Heard series allowed her to determine that the videos resembled the psychological coercion used in military interrogations. Writing to Ellis, Brandon said, quote, "What my conversations with you have reminded me of is that these DEI programs may not only not change hearts and minds in ways that are beneficial, but they can cause real harm and distress." She continued, "What I know of interview and interrogation methods whose goal is cooperation in order to elicit useful and valid information is that attacking an individual's loyalty, intelligence, abilities, and leadership qualities or appearance is counterproductive and is likely to make that individual less cooperative rather than more cooperative." So that is how she defined this Hear and Heard series. Brandon is describing the very essence of DEI. As the examples in my forthcoming book demonstrate, DEI questions American values. Its training causes distress, not toleration and unity. And employees at companies around the country are being forced to undergo such trainings, even though these sessions have nothing to do with their actual job responsibilities. Still, for years, Fortune 500 companies offered or required DEI sessions, even as the sessions had nothing to do with the services or products a company provides or produces. As of 2024, nearly every Fortune 500 company had a DEI statement on its website, though this began to change as 2024 rolled into 2025. I can tell you that as a fact because I counted. I actually wrote a paper and counted them all. I think there were about 12 that did not have a DEI statement. Company officials first began changing their position on DEI after state attorneys general warned companies that their DEI practices, including the addition of race-based ratios to corporate hiring goals, may violate state and federal civil rights laws. For example, in 2024, Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody asked the state's Commission on Human Relations to investigate Starbucks for using such ratios in hiring. 1 year earlier, the state attorneys general from 13 states wrote a joint letter to Fortune 100 companies on the issue of using race-based employment practices. People are watching now. They know what to look for. Chad Ellis is not alone in the complaints that he has made. Okay, so I've laid out a set of problems that critical race theory has brought us and what DEI have brought across the country today. So what solutions do I have for you? What are the answers? Racial discord was and is a challenge in American culture. Critical race theorists are not wrong to draw attention to actual racial problems, but their obsession with viewing everything in society through the lens of race is the wrong response to healing America's racial divides. The bigger problem is that critical race theory is reviving racial divisions and stoking racial resentment that this country, as a whole, has fought so admirably to overcome. Critical race theory is turning the past into the present and the future. This is the first shared idea for educators and students. As part of our history, America failed to live up to its promise of equality for all. However, America is the only nation where the founding citizens established a creed that allowed future generations to develop laws and a habitus that could not be maintained unless the laws and cultural assumptions condemned discrimination and racism. These subjects of racism and America's creed of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all are at the most basic level of understanding moral and cultural issues. The failure to live up to our national ethos and ideals was a problem of behaviors and actions based on people's moral understanding, not a problem with the American creed itself. What I'm saying is, the problems that we had in the past were decisions of those who believed that it was appropriate at the time, that it would ever be appropriate to have an institution of slavery in the United States. That is a problem of those individuals. It is not a problem with the American creed. It is not a problem with the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. In his 1990 book, The Content of Our Character, Shelby Steele says that although, quote, blacks still suffer from racism, the lives of black Americans are, quote, more integrated than they have ever been before. Race does not determine our fates as powerfully as it once did, which means it is not the vital personal concern it once was. Before the 60s, race set the boundaries of black life. Anti-black racism still exists, but it is no longer a defining feature of American life. And that is an important message to the students. The second shared idea on which we should base educational content and cultural discussion, including civics and social studies in K-12 schools, is that Americans should want the extraordinary legacy of Black Americans' perseverance against all odds to represent the strength and grace of American character. For this section of my book, I rely on the research of John Butcher, now emeritus at the University of Texas. He wrote a book called Entrepreneurship and Self-Reliance Among Black Americans. I think that's the full title. He writes, quote, "There is nothing permanent about underclass status. Those who are oppressed or disadvantaged should not reflexively turn to disruption, resistance, or violence. Butler says that, quote, after the people develop a sense of self-help, values pertaining to education, family, and self-motivation follow almost automatically." And what he's saying is that Black Americans, as they struggled against slavery, as they struggled against the ultimate failures of Reconstruction at the time, of the Jim Crow era, that they developed cultures and they developed a resilience among themselves and created institutions. And I commend his book to you. His discussion and research on Black millionaires and Black Americans who paid their way out of slavery at the turn of the 20th century is a fascinating counterpoint to the arguments that critical race theory has made today. Butler concludes that, quote, "Despite the barriers thrown up by white America, Black Americans produced the great men and women who made their marks in history. Americans who were Black worked towards self-actualization to fulfill their own personal ambitions. They were entrepreneurs despite racist treatment and discriminatory policies. They emphasized family and community and religious activities. They saw education as a ladder to success and created opportunity when there was none. Who would not want to embrace these things as a part of our shared national identity?" Third, love your enemies. Most Americans know of Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to judge one another by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. But critical race theorists such as Ibram X. Kendi, who made himself famous by talking about, quote, anti-racism, which is actually racism by another name, he and other critical minds consider colorblindness to be a, quote, mask to hide racism. We should consider another of Reverend King's lessons, one that originated well before the Civil Rights Movement. King, of course, was a pastor and wrote an entire series of sermons on the idea of loving one's enemies. He said, "Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars." He said, "Upheaval after upheaval has reminded us that modern man is traveling along a road called hate in a journey that will bring us to destruction and damnation. Far from being a pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, the command to love one's enemy is an absolute necessity for our survival. Love even for enemies is the key to the solution of the problems of our world." And as many of you who watched the funeral, the remembrance of Charlie Kirk several weeks ago may remember what Charlie Kirk's wife said about his funeral. So taken together, acknowledging the meaning of our founding documents, as well as the past failures to live up to them, recognizing the success of Black Americans under the most difficult of circumstances as a credit to those individuals and as a part of America's identity, and loving our enemies, or at least aspiring to do so, these three concepts form the basis for a response to critical race theory, matching one theory with another. These three ideas are civil at their very core, humbly acknowledging America's imperfections while honoring the unique features of our constitutional republic. Most important, perhaps, a civil theory gives us something to unite around and aspire to, not something that divides, disrupts, and in the end, destroys everything it touches. In the few minutes I have remaining with you, let me ask one final question and offer an answer to it. So is it possible to do this? Is it actually the case that Americans are so divided today, so polarized, that reaching agreement is impossible? So after finishing Splinter, to answer this question, I conducted a nationally representative survey asking questions involving some of the most hot-button issues involving American life today, including questions about DEI, quote, gender, teaching children about marriage and the value of work, and more. Pollsters, news anchors, and newspaper columnists say America is too polarized. The day before the 2024 presidential election, the New Yorker released an article entitled, quote, "The Americans Prepping for a Second Civil War," which seemed to anticipate that a nation-shattering conflict would erupt no matter who won. During President Joe Biden's term, a survey conducted in 2022 found that Americans ranked political extremism or polarization as one of their biggest concerns, which was an unusual finding compared with previous results. Usually, polls asking this question for Americans' top priorities found that the economy and foreign conflicts occupied the top spots, not polarization. Social media platforms such as Facebook and X, formerly known as Twitter, and cable news programs seem designed for people to argue. Conflict sells advertising and makes for good ratings, but if you watch the evening news or practice, quote, doom scrolling through social media feeds before going to bed, you would think Americans have little to nothing in common. Hollywood, of course, is not helping. In 2024, the film studio A24 released a movie called Civil War, starring Kristen Dunst, that portrays an America violently divided. In the film, a block of states has seceded from the Union, and characters live in a dystopian future in which the White House is calling airstrikes on civilians. Not a comforting scenario. One reviewer in The Atlantic said the film had, quote, "an uncomfortable resonance in these politically polarized times." Yet, does it? Or are Americans being told by the experts that the nation is polarized when in fact there is widespread agreement on issues crucial to our daily lives? So here's what the survey that I conducted uncovered. Americans care about character and virtue and want children in school to learn these things. 74% of my respondents were in favor. Americans want educators to teach civics more in school. 57% were in favor, so that students can be prepared to be contributing members of society when they grow up. The respondents to the survey believe that your biological sex is fixed and want school officials to call a student by the name and pronouns that are consistent with the child's birth certificate, the name that their parents lovingly gave them. 60% were in favor. Respondents did not want young children taught that they can change their, quote, gender, 61%, or any students to have access to books in school that depict graphic sexual activity, 69% were opposed to that. Americans do not want college admissions officers to judge student applicants as using racial preferences. Such preferences are at the centerpiece of DEI. 52% oppose the use of racial preferences. If surveys reveal that over time, a majority of respondents do not want college admissions officers to use race as the most important factor in college admissions, these results become a part of our shared norms. To put a finer point on it, prevailing opinions help decide how voters and policymakers and members of communities respond to the questions they face. Highlighting these levels of agreement can help strengthen communities. The polarization today that we find politically, where Americans largely agree that they have high levels of disfavor with Congress, is different than the issues. Across the issues, there's actually widespread agreement on some of the subjects that the media would have us think only divide Americans. With information like this, lawmakers can confidently design policies that are consistent with voters' positions, robust research, and our Constitution, creating positive outcomes for citizens, voters, families, and children. To be fair, no single survey is enough to explain the big questions about what is happening around us. Neither should lawmakers adopt public policies based on surveys alone. And for this reason, in my forthcoming book, I did not rely exclusively on the results from my poll in the chapters within. But sometimes policymakers have to lean against current public preferences as they design public policies, especially when the evidence from research and the outcomes of those policies contradict civil rights law, for example. My hope is that Americans, after taking a closer look at the issues, can have better informed debates on subjects that matter to them. I am politically conservative and won't hide my positions, but I hope to create more light than heat, giving people more information on key topics by laying out the prevailing opinions on the issues and the findings from research, the research literature on these topics. So, in addition to the quick list that I provided above, here is what else my book, The Polarization Myth, covers. First, Americans oppose racial discrimination. I already gave you the numbers on how many oppose using racial preferences in college admissions, but most Americans want GPA and test scores used for student admissions to college, not your immutable characteristics. I interviewed the first black president of Houghton University, a Christian college in central New York. And in my interview with him, he said, quote, "We had a different set of problems in the 1950s and 60s around race in the United States than we have today." He went on, "Is this to suggest that the United States is in a post-racial and ethnic utopia where we don't continue to have challenges? Of course not. We still have challenges," he says, "but this is not the United States of the 50s and 60s. There's more of his interview in my book. Second, and on the topic of K-12 schools, Americans want educators to teach children about character and virtue. I wish I could tell you that I could quickly go into how we teach civics in education in schools today. However, there's a bigger problem, and that's that most students can't read. The reading level of students across the country today are abysmally low. They're reaching historical lows. So, I offer a brief history of the reading wars in my chapter. I'll spare you from that tonight. It's interesting though, to origin. But teaching students to read, basing instruction on phonics is going to be an important first step before we can start to introduce more complicated topics like civics to young people. The other item that should be taught to young people today, and it was also a survey question that I asked in writing my book, was whether or not parents and the general public were in favor of teaching students to finish school, either get a job or enter college for a terminal degree, and get married before you have children, should be something that young people should be taught, and that the evidence behind forming a family is strong, and that the outcomes for young people are far better who come from married and intact families than those who do not. This is known as the success sequence. It was developed many years ago by researchers at the Brookings Institution and AEI, and now the Heritage Foundation has model legislation that lawmakers can use that will have state school boards develop a curriculum informing students of the benefits of finishing high school, getting a job or entering a terminal degree for college, and getting married before you have children. We need to let children know that. They need to know what those outcomes are. Finally, Americans agree that young children should not be exposed to graphic sexual content, nor be taught that a person can choose one's, quote, gender. The survey respondents, especially parents, do not want this information represented in books on school library shelves, nor do they want children taught about such things in elementary and middle school. Agreement was strongest in my survey when the survey question asked about students in kindergarten through third grade, and that those students not be taught that biology is not fixed for themselves. To finish the book, the last chapter talks about why closing the U.S. Department of Education is so essential to education policy today, and why that is. Yes, thank you very much. Funny, I have to tell you a story. So it was mentioned earlier that the director of my center, Lindsay Burke, left to now serve in the Trump administration, and she used to say, because we would travel, all around and give lectures together and meet with lawmakers, that the only time people tend to clap when I gave a speech was when I said we should close the U.S. Department of Education. Apparently that still holds true. Overall, the survey demonstrates that Americans are more closely aligned on key issues than the experts described in my introduction would have us believe. Education lies at the center of many of these issues, from race to sex to the value of marriage and getting a job. We cannot investigate any of these topics for long without arriving at schools and instruction. So, as to the question of whether public opinion is too fickle to rely on, the survey results in my book are supported by findings from other polling, even if public opinion is never final. The same public that turned from Pompey to Caesar went on to split again in Shakespeare's play, but the trends in current opinion, when paired with research findings, build support for policies that align with prevailing opinions today. This information is especially helpful when politicians and the media want us to think that certain positions are isolated and that Americans are polarized, when in fact, Americans agree on important issues. We can hope that the opinions binding Americans on our cultural and even moral questions point not to a pending civil war, but rather to the prospect that our nation has more holding us together than driving us apart. Thank you very much. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. I don't know if any cards were passed forward or if there's a microphone. I know we have several. There's a gentleman here who I saw first, so I will let you go. I'll repeat his question. If you say it loud enough for me to hear, I'll repeat it.
Throughout history, Marxism, fascism, totalitarianism never succeeded because they do not incorporate common sense. What works, what doesn't work. You see this in New York City with this Mondami. These theories just don't have a chance of ever working. Will cripple New York completely. And then you have to go back and forth, back again. And so, this idea that the communist ideas will never prevail over the capitalistic system, it's just not going to happen. Eventually, it would work out that way. Temporarily, it looks like it's scary.
So the comment, thank you very much for your comment. The comment was that even as Marxism continues to resurface every couple of generations, because it doesn't work, it eventually does fade away. And I think that while I agree with you completely, thank you, that it does not work, it is also true though that it does resurface every couple of generations. And just when we thought we were done with critical race theory and DEI, we now have who may ostensibly be the mayor of New York City. And so I think it is crucial that we inform young people where the roots of these ideas come from. I think it is essential that students be taught that these ideas of, quote, equity or social justice actually have roots in a field of identity politics that judges people, based on their immutable characteristics and not based on their decisions. So I think continuing over and over again to include the failures of communism it's essential to K-12 learning. So thank you for your comment. So I have a couple of questions that were forwarded to me here. The first one is: do you think that school choice funding by states to parents will make charter schools obsolete? P.S. Thanks for your work on charters. You're welcome. So I think that school choice has become education choice. What we once called school choice was allowing parents to choose how and where, choose where their children learn. So in 1991, when Minnesota passed the nation's first charter school law, that was a revelation, right? It seemed to be the capstone on Milton Friedman, the great economist's career, where he had predicted that one day we would have a system of choice in education in the U.S. For those who may not be familiar with charter schools are public schools that are started by private individuals, community leaders, parents, teachers. They have an independent school board, usually, from their local district in which they're located, usually. The difference between a public charter school and a traditional school is that if a charter school fails to live up to what is written in its charter or contract, you can close it down if it fails. Traditional schools, as you know, can stay open for decades, right? And they can fail all they want. So what has happened more recently, so after the first charter school law passed in Minnesota, the nation's first school voucher passed, which was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and there they gave certificates to children in low-income families to attend a private school of their choice. Fast forward to 2011, and in Arizona, they adopted what became known as education savings accounts. And with an education savings account, the state deposits a portion of a child's spending from the state funding formula into a private account that parents can use to buy education products and services for their children. So it takes the idea of a voucher and expands even more. You can customize your child's learning experience. So back to the question. Do I think that school choice, education choice as we know it, will make charter schools obsolete? I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because every state, our 50 laboratories of democracy, does this slightly differently. I think in a place like Arizona that has 550 charter schools, they have a thriving system of public charter schools that is serving well over 100,000 students in that state. In other states like Kentucky, they passed a charter school law, but the charter school law was so restricted they couldn't even open a school. Okay, so a state like that is going to need a private scholarship program like education savings accounts. A state like Oklahoma has adopted a program by which parents will spend a certain sum of money on their child's education, report it on their taxes, and get a tax credit for what they spend on their child's education. In Florida, you get spending in an account that you spend on school tuition, tutors, etc., etc. So it looks different across all 50 states, and it should. Those options should all be available. The goal of the Heritage Foundation is for all 50 states to have an education savings account program, as well as for all 50 states to have a charter school. It should, all of these options, just as homeschooling is available across all 50 states today. That's the goal. The goal is to create a wide variety of options so that parents can choose a learning option for their child based on their students' needs. So, good question. The next one's just as good, even better. How close are we to closing the Department of Education? Well, looking at my watch, it won't happen tonight. However, I think we should notice a couple of things. So first, when the new administration came into office, the first thing they did was file a RIF, or reduction in force, which removed about 2,000 employees from the 4,000 strong department. So that was a big first step. The second thing that happened, and shortly following that, was that the secretary filed a interagency agreement with the Department of Labor for the Department of Labor to take over adult ed programs, which is a part of, I think it's Title III, no, it might be Title II of federal education law. Okay? And that interagency agreement is the model by which we can downsize the Department of Education, right? The agency needs to have these interagency memos of understanding, right? Moving the Individuals with Disabilities for in Education Act to Health and Human Services, for example. Moving the nation's report card, the testing program that helps us see how poorly students are doing in math and reading, moving that to, say, the Census Bureau. Right? These interagency agreements are a model for downsizing the agency. It will require a piece of legislation from Congress in order to ultimately shutter the agency. It will. The Department of Education is written into law, and so it's going to take some disentangling in order to do that. I am hopeful, though, and I think someone asked me this question earlier this evening, and there are two possible outcomes. I think one possible outcome is that the department will become so small we will forget that it existed. Or Congress will actually use a model bill developed by the Heritage Foundation, it's available on our website, to close the agency. So I will tell you, we are closer than we have ever been. Thank you. If so much of critical theory originated in Columbia University, why isn't Columbia target number one instead of Harvard? Well, if you remember, they were. Actually, the Trump administration did, in fact, withhold federal spending from Columbia. So Columbia was absolutely one of the first. I mean, look, when I started writing my book, started writing Splinter, I mean, one of the first examples that I came across of this application of critical race theory were students who occupied the Columbia Library during finals season and made it so loud that students couldn't study, and they were chanting, "Decolonize the Columbia curriculum," which I think means that they didn't want anyone who was white to have a book that was studied at Columbia. I'll let you decide for yourself. So Columbia is certainly, they have also now, thank you, begun to make arrangements with the Trump administration to make a deal. Okay, at our local community college, after a 9-month quest, the trustees voted yesterday to remove the DEI mission statement from the college website. But the college has a new initiative, the access advocates. What are some other terms you're seeing that try to disguise DEI on campuses and within corporations? Thank you for that question, because I actually wrote a paper that just came out a month ago called Disguising DEI. And I am pleased to say that exactly 1 week after our paper came out, Clemson University dissolved their DEI office, and they told reporters, yes, thank you, they told reporters that they had read a paper by the Heritage Foundation. I had a terrific co-author with that report, so all credit goes to my friend Mike Gonzalez. So they often will call it belonging, so they'll call it equity and belonging. They will call it multiculturalism. They will call it, often they'll put it under the guise of microaggressions, because microaggressions is this idea that words are actual violence instead of physical violence, which falls into the very abstract concept of, from Michel Foucault, dealing with the nature of language and how we describe the world. It was wrapped into Freud's psychoanalysis, and that was used by Max Horkheimer and the critical race theorists. So the microaggressions is a part of it. Those are a couple of them. I think they figure if they can remove one of the terms, like equity, and replace it with something else, that they can keep diversity or inclusion. But I will tell you, there are some universities like Princeton that are keeping it. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, Princeton opened a new office on DEI on their campus, which is just a mess. Okay, so the next one. Are we a democracy or a constitutional republic based upon both the laws of nature and nature's God? Well, we are certainly a constitutional republic, and I do believe that the God's name was used purposefully in our founding documents. Now, it is also important to note that freedom of religion was a crucial part of our founding fathers, and as when they arrived here. And I think it is essential that we continue to recognize that and respect that. Just as the freedom to speak and freedom of expression are also key parts of the Bill of Rights. So that's all I have to say about that. Are parental rights a constitutional right? So I would say not, so yes, they are a constitutional right in the sense that the U.S. Supreme Court has multiple times upheld the idea and written in opinions that parents are a child's primary caregiver, and that it is one of the opinions from many years ago says that it is one of the oldest recognized rights that anyone has, that any civilization has, is the parents to raise their children. There is an effort underway right now to add it to the U.S. Constitution. I think it might be more likely to come in legislation. Congress is considering a Parent Bill of Rights based on work that Heritage has done, Heritage and others like the Alliance Defending Freedom. And the Parent Bill of Rights would read something like this. It would say, parents are a child's primary caregiver, and then there would be a strict scrutiny clause that would say, and no public official may interfere with this right unless there's a compelling governmental interest and it can't be accomplished any other way. So something to that effect may be added to federal law. It's under consideration now, and I would say there are 25 states that have adopted some form of a Parent Bill of Rights right now, and that to me is essential. I think to have states adopting bills of rights, Parent Bills of Rights right now is absolutely essential. The next one, in your opinion, how much of the emphasis on DEI in our schools and institutions have been financed and supported by foreign powers and globalist interests who wish to see the United States collapse from within to pave the way for their globalist control system? That's a great question. If you had asked me a couple of years ago, I either would have feigned ignorance or skipped it and gone on to another one. But I'll tell you who I met a couple of weeks ago. I met a student named Elsa from Stanford. And she wrote a report for Stanford's student newspaper. And she said that she had been contacted by someone who was a part of the CCP and asked her to come to China and only stay for about 24 to 48 hours, otherwise she would have to get a visa and it would attract attention. But there is, she said that on Stanford's campus, this happens all the time. She says that there are unidentified callers who will call up people who are especially working in highly sensitive fields around engineering and computer science, and will try to gain access to information that they have. So we invited her to Heritage and had her come and speak before an audience there. I think that there is a tremendous effort underway right now of Chinese espionage on American campuses. And the evidence is being told to us by students, and if we don't listen, we are putting ourselves in a tremendous disadvantage, a very vulnerable situation. As for DEI, I think that many of the protesters that we saw who had encampments on college campuses earlier this year and last year, they were international students. They were students who came from places like Qatar and other countries that had no interest in seeing the success of Israel as a nation. And so, yes, I think that there is, I think there are some who have pointed to Iranian interests funding these disruptions on campus. They happened very quickly, right? They all came together very quickly after October 7th. So it was hard to argue that it was simply just an organic movement. How many more would you like me to take? How much time do we have? All right, I'll keep going. I'll take a couple of more. Okay. Congress seems way more polarized than the public at large. Why? I should have skipped that one. Hard to say. I will, so there's a key strategy that they teach you in media training, and that is always make sure they answer the question that you want to hear, not the one that you're given. So I'm going to answer this question. I would argue that what is important for us to keep our eye on right now is what's happening in state legislatures. And what's happening across state legislatures and governor's offices today is going to be a lasting foundation for not just education choice, but also parent bills of rights, also defending students from foreign interests. Florida was the first state just a year ago, 2 years ago, that adopted legislation protecting students and universities from engaging with foreign interests, actually prohibiting foreign interests from establishing the kind of relationships that create this infiltration. I think that I mentioned already that there are 25 states that have some form of a parent bill of rights. There are 17 states that have an education savings account or account-style program that is available to every child who can apply in their state. 17 states have a universal education savings account. There are more than half of all states in the U.S. have some form of private school scholarship program. This is tremendous. Remember, it was only 1991, 1992 when the first charter school law passed and then the first school voucher passed. I actually remember those days, right? Kurt Cobain was still writing music, right? It wasn't that long ago. So I think what's happening across states right now is essential, and I think it's not just Washington, right? We really should not be distracted by Congress and shutdowns and whether or not. They've already given up on passing a budget, right? So we have to put that behind us for now, and we have to keep an eye on what states are doing because these really do hold hope for the future. If the left continues to implode, what do you think the future holds? What if the dog catches the car? I think we're seeing a couple of things, and I talk a little bit about this in my book coming out in December. But I think Americans have demonstrated through polling and otherwise that they're tired of hearing from experts who are telling them things that they need to believe, like wear masks and where COVID may or may not have come from, just issuing myths about whether or not critical race theory is in schools, and on and on. So I think Americans are more savvy today than they were about what the so-called experts in the sciences, or who say they are in sciences, are telling us. I think that what we can hope for and what we should be hoping for are the points of agreement. And a couple of key points I'll illustrate for you. One is this whole idea around gender. I think it's very clear that those on the left overstepped their target, right? Overshot their target when it comes to gender. They felt like if they began telling people that you can choose whether or not you're a boy or a girl or something else, that people would just agree with them. But it actually turns out people don't like boys using girls' bathrooms. They don't. They don't like boys playing girls' sports teams. That's right. And I think Americans are in agreement around that. I think that has begun to unite people on the right and the left. In my chapter about that, in the Polarization Myth, I actually interview a mom who had a child who calls themselves transgender, and she talked about how difficult that was for her and her family. I talked to another mom who had a daughter who went through a phase of doing this and what it was like to come out of that phase and what it meant. So I think Americans are ready to rally around ideas like that can unite them. I would say too,